At the height of a glittering evening, inside the Grand Horizon Hotel, where crystal chandeliers dripped with golden light and the air was thick with the perfume of wealth and power, Victoria Langford raised her glass and smiled with the practiced charm of someone who had lived her entire life on the front page. "If anyone here can play this piano flawlessly," she declared, her voice slicing through the hum of laughter and champagne chatter, "I'll marry them tomorrow." The words were meant as a jest, a showy quip to amuse her circle of donors and admirers, but they landed in the room like a dare. Gasps and chuckles rippled across the ballroom, jeweled hands covering painted lips, men in tuxedos shaking their heads as if to say she had gone too far this time, though secretly delighted by her audacity. And then, from the very edge of the crowd, a figure stirred. Leonard Hayes, the janitor in a navy work shirt with his cleaning cart pushed aside, his eyes dark and steady, as though he had been waiting his whole life for this exact moment. The laughter dimmed as he stepped forward, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the marble air. "Do you mean that?" A hush fell. For a heartbeat, no one moved. No one believed the servant boy would dare to answer the Queen's challenge. But Leonard did not blink, and in that silence, every guest felt something shift, as though the night had suddenly turned from performance to destiny. What happens when the one you least expect takes center stage? What happens when a forgotten man dares to claim the spotlight meant for kings and queens? Tell me, if you were there, would you have laughed or would you have believed? Leonard Hayes had always been the kind of man people looked past, the sort who blended into the wallpaper of the Grand Horizon Hotel with his mop and bucket, a shadow moving in service of other people's brilliance, and yet inside him burned a story few could guess. At 28, he had carried more weight than most men twice his age, a childhood filled with chipped pianos in church basements, a mother who worked double shifts at the laundromat to pay rent, and nights spent practicing scales with frozen fingers, because the old heater rattled but never worked right. The hotel uniform he wore now was nothing more than a costume that told only half the truth, for beneath the navy shirt and name tag beat the heart of an artist who had never been given permission to be one. As Victoria's words echoed in the ballroom, Leonard felt every laugh like a hammer against his ribs, the polished guests dismissing the idea of a janitor daring to reach for something so audacious. He could have kept his head down, could have swallowed the sting like he had done 1,000 times before, but tonight something inside him refused to stay silent. His mother's voice whispered from memory, "Never let them tell you what you're worth, son. You carry music in your blood." And so he set the pitcher of ice water aside and stepped into the circle of light that seemed to widen around the glossy black piano. Eyes turned, some narrowing with disdain, others widening with incredulous curiosity, because no one had ever noticed him until this very second. To them, he was invisible, but to himself, he was finally becoming whole. He brushed his fingers across the wood as if greeting an old friend, and when Victoria smirked and gestured toward the bench, certain this would end in embarrassment, Leonard lowered himself onto the seat with a calm that surprised even him. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the anticipation of release, because he knew the truth of his own gift. A truth that no tuxedo, no diamond necklace, no cynical laugh could erase. In that hushed ballroom, under chandeliers that once seemed so far above him, Leonard was no longer just a janitor. He was a man on the brink of revealing the soul he had guarded for nearly 2 decades. The guests whispered, their voices dripping with arrogance, betting he would stumble, waiting for his failure as if it were already written. But Leonard kept his eyes on the keys, every ounce of his being focused on what was about to happen. And in that breathless pause before the first note, he felt the weight of every insult, every dismissal, every night he had played alone in the dark. He carried them all into that moment, not as burdens, but as fuel. The gala had been meant as a playground for the rich, but now, for the first time, it was about to witness something real, something raw, something that could not be bought. And while Victoria Langford thought she was still in control of the game, Leonard Hayes knew the stage had already shifted in his favor. The first note rose into the air like a fragile thread, trembling yet deliberate, and the sound seemed to silence even the most jaded heart in the Grand Horizon Hotel. Leonard's fingers lingered on the keys as though reacquainting themselves with an old language, coaxing the piano to breathe, testing its voice before allowing it to sing, and then, as if a dam had broken, the melody began to pour forth with a force that startled even him. Each note carried not just sound but memory, the chipped ivory of his childhood piano, the late nights spent straining to hear through the static of old recordings, the echo of his mother's humming in the background while folding clothes after a 12-hour shift. The crowd, once brimming with skepticism and whispers, found themselves arrested by the unexpected weight of his music, laughter draining from their faces until only awe remained. The smug man with champagne lowered his glass unconsciously. The pearl-draped woman forgot her rehearsed smile. Even Victoria, leaning on the piano with an air of superiority, found her smirk faltering as her eyes began to track every movement of his hands. Leonard was no longer merely pressing keys. He was telling a story that none of them had been prepared to hear. A story of struggle and resilience and longing, woven into every rising crescendo and every aching pause. He played not to impress, but to release, and the honesty of it struck deeper than any polished conservatory performance ever could. Whispers began again, but this time they carried confusion, even humility. Where did he learn that? Is this some hidden prodigy? This can't be real. Yet Leonard heard none of it, his gaze fixed on the piano, as if he were alone in a room that had forgotten him, his soul flowing into the instrument until the very air trembled. The music shifted from tender fragility to thunderous conviction, chords rolling like storm clouds across the ballroom. Each contrast reminding the audience that beauty and power often come from the unlikeliest places. People leaned forward in their seats without realizing it, drawn in not just by his technique, but by the undeniable truth pulsing through the notes. By the time his right hand began to soar across the higher register, blending joy and sorrow in a dance that seemed older than the room itself, the crowd no longer saw a janitor. They saw a man transformed, a man who had taken their careless mockery and turned it into something magnificent. Victoria's hand, once confidently tapping the piano lid, stilled as she realized the challenge she had thrown so casually had shifted the night into something she could no longer control. The murmurs died, leaving only the sound of Leonard's music filling every corner, spilling into every guarded heart, forcing each person to remember that greatness often hides in plain sight. And as the final notes of his passage faded into a delicate hush, the silence that followed was not the silence of doubt, but of reverence, as though the very walls of the hotel knew they had just witnessed the beginning of a story that could not be forgotten. The last note of Leonard's impromptu symphony had scarcely faded when the room erupted, not with polite applause as might be expected at a gala, but with thunderous clapping, whistles, and voices raised in disbelief. The kind of raw outpouring that no one could have predicted from a crowd that had, only minutes before, mocked him as a joke. Phones shot into the air, recording the man who had just turned their laughter into reverence, capturing every second of the stunned faces and the humbled silence that had preceded this storm of praise. Leonard rose slowly from the bench, bowing his head slightly, his hands lingering on the edge of the piano as if reluctant to leave it. And in that moment, he looked more like a weary soldier than a performer, a man who had fought and won a battle, not with words, but with music. Victoria Langford forced a smile, clapping with perfectly manicured hands while her mind spun, realizing that the story she thought she was orchestrating had slipped out of her grip. Now the cameras were no longer pointed at her, but at him, the janitor who had dared to step into her spotlight and made it his own. The whispers turned into conversations, reporters calling their editors, donors texting friends. Each person desperate to be the first to share the tale of the night, a nobody became unforgettable. Within minutes, the first videos hit social media, shaky footage of Leonard's performance already climbing through thousands of views, hashtags exploding with words like #hidden genius, #janitor prodigy, #millionaire challenge. The digital world amplifying what the ballroom had barely begun to process. Leonard himself, unaware of the storm gathering online, slipped quietly from the piano back toward his cart, intent on resuming his duties as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But there was no going back. The eyes that had once slid past him now followed with a mix of astonishment and respect, and for the first time in his life, he was seen. By midnight, clips of his playing had crossed platforms, shared by influencers, retweeted by celebrities, dissected by critics who insisted they could hear echoes of Rachmaninoff and Chopin in his improvisation, yet agreed there was something unmistakably original in the way he had fused styles. Strangers wrote comments that felt like confessions. I cried watching this. He made me remember my father's old piano, proof that real talent doesn't wear a price tag. But while the internet roared, Leonard sat alone in his small apartment above the laundromat, his work shirt draped over a chair, staring at his cracked laptop as notifications flooded in faster than he could read them. A friend from childhood messaged him, "Bro, you're viral, millions of views, start a channel now." Another sent, "You don't realize what you just did. You broke the internet." Leonard rubbed the back of his neck, torn between disbelief and unease because he had never sought fame. Music had always been his sanctuary, not a spectacle. Yet the storm would not stop. By dawn, his name trended alongside world news, his face plastered across feeds with captions like, "When the billionaire challenged the wrong man." Victoria woke to the same flood, her phone buzzing with publicists urging her to spin the narrative, to align herself with the man she had unknowingly crowned. At the Grand Horizon Hotel, the general manager fielded calls from news stations, begging for interviews, while donors insisted they had seen Leonard's brilliance from the start, rewriting their memories to soften their earlier cruelty. But beneath the glitter of the viral explosion was something deeper, a shift in how people viewed possibility itself. Leonard Hayes had walked into that ballroom as invisible labor, and by the time the sun rose, he was a symbol of every hidden gift overlooked by a world obsessed with status. The storm was no longer his to control, and yet for the first time he felt the weight of destiny pressing against his shoulders. Not as a burden, but as an open door waiting to be stepped through. In the days that followed, Leonard Hayes discovered that fame was not a gentle tide, but a crashing wave, relentless and unpredictable, sweeping him into places he had never intended to go. At first it was messages from strangers, mothers who wrote to say their children stopped fighting and listened in silence when his video played. Veterans confessing that the sound of his music had broken through years of numbness. Young dreamers who admitted they had almost given up until they saw him sit at that piano and prove that life could turn in an instant. Then came the encounters in person, faces he had never seen before approaching him with tears in their eyes. A widow in a gray shawl clasped his hand outside the hotel lobby and whispered that for the first time since her husband's passing, she had felt peace listening to him play. A teenage boy with paint-stained fingers told him he had hidden his sketchbook from everyone out of shame. But after seeing Leonard's courage, he vowed to show the world what he could draw. Leonard listened, humbled, realizing with each story that what he had once kept private had now become a bridge carrying hope into lives far beyond his own. It was both beautiful and heavy, because for every thank you there came an expectation, a question of when he would play again. What stage he would choose, as though the world had decided his future before he could breathe enough to decide it for himself. Yet amid the chaos, there were moments that pierced deeper than the noise. One afternoon, while mopping the banquet hall floors, a woman in a faded denim jacket walked in with a toddler on her hip. Her eyes shone with unshed tears as she told him her little boy never spoke, never focused. Not since his father died, but when she played Leonard's video, he had sat still, wide-eyed, listening until the very end. "That music gave me back a piece of him," she whispered, clutching her child closer. Leonard felt his throat tighten, words failing him, because how could he explain that he had only been surviving that night? That he had sat down at the piano to remind himself he was still alive, not to save anyone else. And yet here was proof that his private rebellion had become someone else's redemption. Walking home later, the city lights blurring in his tired eyes, Leonard understood something that shook him more than the applause, more than the headlines. His music no longer belonged to him alone. It had become a language people needed, a balm for wounds he could not see, and though the thought terrified him, it also made him feel less alone than he had in years. He sat at the old upright in his apartment, chipped keys under his fingers, and whispered into the empty room, "If this is what it means, then let it be." For the first time, he realized that talent was not just a gift, but a responsibility, one that asked him to keep playing even when he wanted to hide. And as the world clamored for more, Leonard began to see that the challenge thrown carelessly by Victoria Langford had unlocked not just his destiny, but the hearts of countless strangers who had been waiting silently for a song to remind them they were not forgotten. 2 weeks later, Leonard Hayes found himself standing in the wings of the Uptown Theater in Dallas, the velvet curtains towering like ancient guardians, the murmur of 1,000 voices rolling through the air like distant thunder. And for the first time in his life, he was not the man sweeping the aisles, but the man they had come to see. Victoria Langford stood beside him, her emerald gown catching the glow of the stage lights. Her face softened now, not with smugness, but with something closer to respect, perhaps even pride, though she kept her words measured. "This time they came for you," she whispered, and Leonard nodded, his palms damp, his heart pounding in a rhythm louder than any applause he had ever heard. When his name was announced, the room erupted, and as he stepped onto the stage, the spotlight bathed him in a brilliance that felt almost unreal. The Steinway Grand gleamed under the lights, immaculate and intimidating, but when he sat down and let his fingers hover above the keys, the world shrank into silence. His first piece was one of his own, a composition stitched together from years of memory. Fragments of gospel hymns his mother used to hum, echoes of Chopin he had imitated as a boy, the rawness of street music that had once drifted from passing cars outside his apartment window. The melody rose like a tide, swelling with warmth and retreating with tenderness, drawing the audience into a story without words, a story of struggle, endurance, and quiet beauty. By the second piece, the silence was so complete that Leonard could hear the breath of the woman in the front row as she clasped her pearls, and when he leaned into a haunting minor progression, a hush swept across the theater like a collective sigh. Between songs, Leonard spoke softly into the microphone, his voice steady despite the quake in his chest. "Most people will only ever know you from what they see in a few seconds. But that's never the whole story. We all carry something bigger inside us. Sometimes all it takes is the right moment to let it out." The audience erupted in applause, not just for his playing, but for the truth of those words. Because every person in that room carried some hidden fragment of themselves they had buried, and Leonard's music had given them permission to remember it. He played for 40 minutes straight, each piece a confession, each crescendo a declaration that talent does not wear uniforms and worth is not measured in wealth. When he finally returned to the piece he had first played at the gala, the one that had ignited the firestorm, the crowd seemed to lean forward as one, hungry to relive the moment that had already become legend. But this time, Leonard played it differently, stretching the pauses, layering new flourishes, pouring into it not just his defiance, but his gratitude, his awe at the path that had brought him here. The final note rang out, shimmering into silence, and then came the explosion, a standing ovation so fierce the wooden floor shook beneath the thunder of feet, applause that refused to stop, cheers that felt like waves crashing over him. Leonard bowed his head, humbled, overwhelmed, realizing that for the first time he was no longer playing just to survive or to prove himself, but to give something away, something larger than himself. In the lobby afterward, people came not only to congratulate him, but to share their own buried dreams. A man who once sang but had stopped, a woman who had left her violin in an attic decades ago, a young mother who whispered that she might start painting again. Leonard listened to them all, his heart swelling with the strange joy of connection, and he knew then that his music had become more than performance. It was a bridge, carrying the unseen and the forgotten into the light. And as he stepped out into the cool night air, the city alive with possibility, he realized the stage no longer frightened him. It had become home. When the final guests drifted into the night and the theater lights dimmed, Leonard Hayes lingered on the steps outside, the cool Dallas air wrapping around him like a quiet blessing. He looked back at the Uptown Theater, its doors closing slowly, and for the first time he allowed himself to believe that his life had truly changed. Not because of the applause, not because of the headlines or the sudden attention from strangers, but because he had seen with his own eyes the power of sharing what he had always tried to keep hidden. His music was no longer a secret refuge in a dim apartment above a laundromat. It was a living thing, breathing in the hearts of people who had needed it, weaving into their stories in ways he might never fully know. Victoria approached, her heels clicking softly on the pavement, and for once her presence did not feel like a shadow over him, but like a companion on a road neither of them had expected. "The rest is up to you now," she said, her voice free of pretense, and Leonard nodded, smiling faintly, because deep down he had always known it was. He walked into the night carrying no fame, no fortune, only the certainty that what you carry inside matters, even if the world laughs first, even if no one believes until the moment arrives. That truth was enough, and as the city lights shimmered around him, Leonard whispered to himself that he would keep playing, not for viral clips, not for promises of wealth, but because his music was a story that deserved to be told again and again. Maybe yours is too. Maybe you're holding onto a gift you've hidden for years, waiting for a stage that feels worthy. But what if the right moment is closer than you think? What if the world is waiting for you to share it now? Tell me, if you've ever kept a talent in the dark, what's stopping you from letting it shine today?